So yesterday I posted a video up on Instagram in Reels, put forward a question regarding toxic masculinity, how it's best healed. Some great conversations in the comments came from that, some great questions, including how do we define it, where do we start, who do we victimize, how is it healed? And of course this is a large conversation. Wanted to bring perhaps another question out into but maybe some pondering, I guess. Something interesting I found as I looked into the meaning of toxic. And I wonder if this is something that might help or aid in the discussion around how we might identify and heal toxic masculinity, which I believe can exist as a trait, as an energy that it broadens out to a cultural force and a norm, particularly in males, but not specifically gender specific to males, because I think both the masculine and feminine can live in all genders, and that includes the toxic, masculine and feminine, and the healthy, or maybe, I don't know, some people use the word the divine, masculine and feminine, as the opposite to that. And so both energies and both expressions, of course, we know affect culture and create systems and things that we live in and are subject to. So, being a poet, I love words, and I love to find out what the etymology or meaning or origins are of words. And toxic has some really interesting, has an interesting etymology and background. I just had my computer open here, and my second computer quite noisy. It says that toxic is from the late Latin toxicus, which means poisoned, a poisonous masculinity, of poisonous femininity. From the Latin toxicum, which means poison, from the Greek toxikon, right? Again, which was a poison used for arrows. So this is interesting, this arrow connection. If you do some research, you'll discover that technology has always played a huge role in warfare. Today we're looking at tech warfare, drones and all kinds of things, but in the Bronze Age, the technology of that changed the face of how combat was done amongst warriors. And the arrow is no exception either, the bow and arrow, as weaponry. And so there is this connection with the word toxic and this Greek word toxikon, which was the poison used for arrow, and toxikon is the neuter form of toxikos. Okay, so it's an adaptation of the word toxikos, which is toxikos, and that pertains to arrows and archery. Thus, the bow from toxon, bow, probably a word that was borrowed from the Latin taxus, etc. Here's the thing. Here's what I've been kind of mulling over in maybe this mytho-poetic idea of why this toxic masculinity, this energy and force, is kind of hard to nail down. If we move back to a few hundred years or 1,000 years, we're going to have people in hand-to-hand combat with swords. And when you fight, particularly in honor kind of battles, warriors fight hand-to-hand, which is always interesting. You see in movies, you know, the hero and the villain will drop their guns, and it always ends up in some hand-to-hand combat, right? That's kind of the most heroic and honoring way to fight is hand to hand or face to face. If you remove that and you have bow and arrows, you don't know where that thing comes from. In many cases, there are a lot of movies that have been produced in the last 100 years where you will find a whole army of archers stand back at a wall or back at a distance and shoot an arrow over the top. But we're talking, thousands, hundreds of thousands of arrows from archers being shot out into a field of an oncoming army. And if you were the only army with archers and that technology, you had a huge advantage. You also started to eliminate this whole idea of face-to-face combat, honor killing, a warrior's real pursuit with the enemy. So it's kind of like what we say is would be equivalent to dropping a bomb, or a drone dropping a bomb or something like that. There's great distance, and it's not personified. There's no face to look at. And so if we bring that back to this whole idea of toxic masculinity, what I find really interesting is that we have all experienced, I think, both male and female, the poisons, the darts that come towards us and infiltrate society. We've also find that many of us have personally been face to face with somebody toxic that has a sword. But on the whole, I think one of the challenges with dealing with it is that it's almost like there's an army on the hill shooting these poisonous arrows out towards victims, towards an oncoming people, maybe innocent people, maybe they're not fighting. And at that distance, you don't see face to face. Now that suits the aggressor, that suits the predator as well, because they get to distance themselves from the effect of death and destruction upon those that they're shooting arrows from. So I'm going to leave it there. Those are some, I just found that a really interesting connection between this whole idea of distance, this whole idea of it's being difficult to identify who the perpetrator is, maybe only seeing a crowd on the hill, the distance that the perpetrator has to the suffering of the victim, yet it is still an issue. And this whole idea of toxicity, of course, I think is perpetuated, and the distance is perpetuated, particularly through social media, particularly through writings, particularly through a lot of commentary and noise, which becomes terribly impersonal. And then both sides are just shooting arrows at each other, not having face-to-face conversations regarding their wounds, regarding why they're there, regarding their purpose, regarding who handed them the bow arrow, who formed that, how they were taught to shoot that. And so perhaps one of the solutions for this is distance, and bringing the distance right down so that people are face to face when they're in conflict, when they're together, and that the sufferers are able to move forward to speak up and show their wounds. Just some thoughts. Would love to hear yours.